We had, by this time, about 300 wounded in the cellars, but I still believed that 30 Corps would be coming up, certainly up to the south bank, within a matter of almost hours, and we could hear them. I think Lord Carrington was across the bridge before we were overrun. A very close run thing. At 8 o'clock I realized that our little battle was finished. We just didn't have the ammunition, and when the other side can run tanks right up to your front window and with no chance of you retaliating, there comes a moment where you can't go on.
There was never any question of surrender. 100 of those who weren't seriously wounded tried to fight their way out. Most of them were captured or killed.
The Market Garden Plan had called for Arnhem Bridge to be held by a whole brigade, nearly 3,000 men, for 2 days. In the event, 740 men held 3.5 days. It was a heroic defense, and it's been justly celebrated. But the story doesn't end here. 3 miles away, the rest of the division was still holding out around the village of Oosterbeek. At Oosterbeek, there was a ferry across the river. If the British could manage to build a bridge here, they could still push on into Germany. Here the airborne troops made their stand. They'd been reinforced by another landing, but they'd also suffered grievous losses. Of the division's 10,000 men, only 3,500 remained to defend the crossing. The ground here, behind Oosterbeek Church, is still scarred by the pits they dug for their light field guns. They form part of an enclave, a mile deep by half a mile wide, going up into the village of Oosterbeek. If they could hold this bridgehead, it was still possible that Horrocks could get his tanks across the Rhine after all.
Psychologically, this was a sea change, because until then we'd been fighting to get to the bridge, and now we were going to be put into a defensive situation to hold a perimeter so as to enable Second Army to come across the Rhine there and to hold this come what may.
Oosterbeek was an unlikely setting for an all-out battle.
A perfectly peaceful Dutch suburban large village, absolute in apple pie order, as though nothing had ever happened. I had not expected to run into armour. I was certainly surprised at the resilience that the Germans were showing, considering all that we'd been told was that they were demoralized and that they were old men and boys and so on. In fact, we had SS soldiers in front of us.
As Horrocks' tanks pushed forward, after taking the bridge at Nijmegen, the airborne soldiers put up an increasingly desperate defense. Casualties were very heavy as the battle raged. Among them was James Clemenson. He was sent to a makeshift hospital in the house of a Dutch civilian next to the church.
And she used to come round every evening and read from the 91st Psalm and encourage people. And she was a most marvellous example, a fantastic woman who kept everybody's courage up.
Only a few hundred yards away, Across the river from the airborne soldiers, help began to arrive. By air, some Polish paratroopers. Then Horrocks's forward parties. If they could get across the river in strength, the division and the plan might be saved. Eventually, Horrocks himself came forward to take a look. Some say that he was looking pale and ill as a result of his desert wounds. He climbed the tower here at Driel, directly across from the Oosterbeek enclave. He could see that the key to the crossing was the small but steep hill called Westerbuing, which dominates the ferry. Once held by Urquhart's men, this position had now been taken by the Germans, who could sweep the ferry with their fire. He himself later said that this was his blackest moment of the war. With the Germans reinforcing from the east, his own force risked being cut off completely. Horrocks ordered his men to attack across the river in strength, but the assault was a disastrous failure. Horrocks and Browning realized the game was up. Rather than reinforce them, they decided to evacuate the airborne men. The following night, the surviving soldiers at Oosterbeek came up. Only some 2,500 eventually made the crossing. Guided by mine tapes, they crept through the woods, down to the river, through a storm of fire. The battle to force the bridges into Germany was over.
A very eerie silence the following morning. None of us knew what in fact had happened.
The Airborne Division had left behind nearly 1,500 dead and more than 6,500 prisoners, many badly wounded.
One of our doctors came along and told us that our soldiers had withdrawn over the Rhine and that we would be taken to a German hospital. That was a horrible feeling, because it was totally unexpected. But it was a very lonely feeling when you're abandoned.
It would be another 4 months before the Allies crossed the Rhine again and captured the Ruhr. But by that time, the Russians were in sight of Berlin. The Allied failure was tragic, because the operation might indeed have shortened the war. Europe might have been very different, and millions of people would not have died, had Market Garden succeeded.